Hello student, I'm Professor Smita Jha and I'm here today to discuss Victorian geology, ruins and mourning. We all are aware of the Victorian classical background, that how traditional they are and how this age is the sharp example, fine example of the amalgamation of the tradition and modernity. Now this topic, Victorian geology, ruins, mourning, is going to be very interesting because it will tell us many things, hidden aspect of the Victorian age. So in the early 19th century, geology was already more distinctly recognizable as a science. Because of its crucial role in industrialization, geology was not fully professionalized. However, and its objects were not quite disentangled from its companions in the 18th century cabinets of curiosity. Victorian literature was also influenced by the developments of this field. The progress of geology and its relations with literature have received some excellent critical attention in recent years. But its roles in the emergence of archaeology has been less considered, with some studies assuming, as Glenn Daniel does in an early history, that there could be no real archaeology before geology, before the doctrine of uniformitarianism was widely accepted. Other studies treat both as rather undifferentiated practices of digging concerned with the past or locate the division between them largely in institutional terms. Post process archaeologists such as Michael Shanks, Christopher Tilley, and others have produced groundbreaking explorations of the conceptual work of archaeology and notes that anything other than a strictly internalist account of the discipline may well be far off. That observation was made in 2004. And although there have been some fine responses to their call for a dialogue between reflections on archaeology as a modern discipline and inquiries into the archaeological imagination in 19th and 20th century cultural form, such a non-internalist account still remains largely unrealized. These new archaeological processes done on ruins related to geology in turn sheds light on how they influence the literary works produced during the era. With the new information available, writers started to indulge in new genres of literature. And it has been pointed out that the Victorian novel was also the birthplace of scientific fiction. That is H.G. Wells' Time Machine. The Time Machine 1895 is an excellent example of this. The study of such works connected different areas of science and social sciences. For instance, Bruce Clark has read The Time Machine as a virtual allegory of classical thermodynamics and shows that its combination of physical and social entropy reflects a wider transfer within the period of concepts and metaphors from physical science to social discourses of degeneration. Neatly linking these scientific context with issues of form, Michael Sayu has argued that the social and physical entropy that are themes of the romance are reflected in its narrative structure, which manifests a type of narrative entropy and thereby raises the spectre of end of fiction. The Victorian age was a time of change, and of a change as far-reaching and comprehensive as it had hardly ever been encountered before. This change, owing to geological advances among many others, rang in Britain's heyday. It led the country straight into modernity and transformed virtually every area of life. On the Victorians, it had a twofold effect. Regarding themselves as the vanguard of progress, they celebrated their achievements with an almost evangelical optimism, while at the same time, the loss of traditional values and beliefs triggered new fears and insecurities as well. This obscure episode in late Victorian publishing history is intriguing for a number of reasons. This was, after all, precisely the period during which the still fluid conceptual boundaries of emergent genre categories like science fiction, fantasy, and horror were beginning to be negotiated, shaped, and defined. The Anthropocene, the new geological epoch defined by the transformative impact of human activity on the planet, has seen a dramatic increase in the pace, scope, and severity of various kinds of environmental degradation, including climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Moreover, according to a plethora of bleak scientific reports, these trends show little sign of abating, boding ill for the future of humanity and life on Earth in general. The experience and anticipation of environmental loss, whether of plant and animal species, ecosystems, landscapes, or an inhabitable planet, cause profound sorrow, which is being felt more and more acutely by a growing portion of the world's population as we move ever deeper into the Anthropocene. However, as yet, we are somewhat at a loss as to how to adequately navigate the effective terrain of environmental breakdown. This sense of Anthropocene was thus stimulated by the geological advances during the Victorian era that led to major finds in the field of archaeology and ecology. As usual, these findings got reflected in the literature of the time, paving a strong foundation for the new genre that was later to be known as science fiction. Another interesting fact about the Victorian era is that when it comes to the concept of death, it could be said that Victorians had a morbid fascination with it. Historians have come to call this fascination the cult of death, which helped to define the period in which they lived for years to come. When a death occurred, it would touch every facet of the family. Death was an ever-present feature in Victorian life. While the mortality rate varied considerably according to one's class, occupation, and region, life expectancy was generally low in the mid-19th century. The mortality for people who lived in cities was 40% higher than the general population. That year, the average expected lifespan for a laborer living in London in mid-19th century was a shocking low 22. The high death rate had many causes, including infections, disease, poor living conditions in the crowded, smog-filled urban areas, and poverty. English cities were notorious for their poor air quality. Due to the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, and sewage often spilled uncontrolled into streets and water sources. Mourning practices were typically grandiose and affected the decoration of the home, the clothes women would wear, and even the ways in which the lost would be memorialized. Although the practice of death, portraiture, and mourning photos had been around for more than 100 years, photography too held an important place in the clutter of mourning artifacts. Victorians dealt with death in a variety of ways which range from the simplest to the most elaborate. For the middle and higher classes, whether professionals, merchants, industrialists, nobility, or royalty, there was a strict code, a ritualization of the processes of mourning and funeral. For the lower and laboring classes, there was much less formality, but there were certainly options provided by undertakers that were aimed at these classes. Looking back at funeral practices in the reign of Victoria, a number of questions are raised. Why did Victorians choose to ritualize death? What were the rituals in which they engaged? What were the outward trappings of mourning? And how and where did they dispose of the deceased? There is a clear association with death and religion. Christian doctrine, especially that of the Roman Catholic Church, believes in life after death and life everlasting. Others hold the view that the time of death is when one celebrates the life of the deceased. It can be argued that during Queen Victoria's long reign, the celebration of death reached its peak, which raises the further question of the degree to which the death, funeral, and grieving for Prince Albert affected the pattern of British mourning. Funerals were big business and were designed for all levels of society. At their most elaborate, they could bring even the great metropolis to a standstill. When the Queen's consort, Prince Albert, died in December of 1861, the whole of the realm went into mourning. Church bells were tolled throughout the land. Churches held special services and shops in many towns were closed. Window blinds in many homes were lowered and kept down as a sign of respect, and no respectable people appeared about except in mourning. Certainly, all the reports suggest that Great Britain came to a virtual halt. However, this was not unique, for when the Duke of Wellington died 9 years earlier, more than 65,000 people came to see him lying in a state, and on the day of the funeral, bells in the Tower hamlets were tolling at minutes intervals throughout the day. Moreover, according to the Times, 90% of shops were fully closed, and the remainder, partially so, flags on public buildings were at half-mast. And there were no mail deliveries in the afternoon. Again, on the death of the Duke of Wellington, all military in the United Kingdom were ordered into full mourning. Letters appeared in the Times pointing out the impact that different periods of mourning would have on trade. As always, there were some who, even in such an event as the death of Wellington, could see the opportunity to turn a profit. A report on the state of trade from Nottingham noted that blacklists will no doubt be much required. The profession of undertakers during this era seemed to have been regarded by many with distaste, if not revulsion. One writer in the Leisure Hour in 1862 described the business as extortionate. He writes, "In numberless instances, the interment of the dead is in the hands of miscreants whom it is almost flattery to compare to the vulture or the foulest carrion bird." He writes further, "The morality is in their hands to use a plain word, robbery. Anyone could set up as an undertaker, but approximately 60% were only undertakers, jackals. Their sole function appears to have been little more than transmitting orders to genuine undertakers. Even some of these had others who turned the business over to them for onward transmission. Each of those in the chain took a cut, thereby making the cost of a funeral all the more expensive. In addition to those directly involved in the funeral industry, there was those who supplied all of the paraphernalia required. In 1869, Cassell's Household Guide listed, in addition to the coffin maker, at least half a dozen other trades and service providers, all of whom supply at first hand of the furnishing undertaker, who in his turn supplies the trade and the public. Thus, the bereaved were often led into spending more than was either necessary or desirable, and paying inflated prices for no purpose other than to increase the profits of those in the industry. Funerals were, for many of the bereaved, a form of conspicuous consumption. Moreover, the various trappings associated with mourning required the most fashionable mourning dress and the greatest possible display. Those in the business of burying the dead or providing the necessary peripherals were never short on the creation of ways to increase their profits. It was commonly, for example, believed that it was bad luck to wear the same mourning clothes to more than one funeral, a practice that would undoubtedly have those selling women's mourning frocks rubbing their hands with glee. In discussion, conspicuous consumption, Thorstein Veblen noted that fashion, and this clearly applies to mourning fashion, is good prima facie evidence of pecuniary success and consequently prima facie evidence of social worth. But not everyone profited from a funeral. When a funeral became a major event, it had ramifications for tradesmen as well. In a letter to the editor, a linen draper, writing to the times when King George IV took ill, noted that he had just completed his spring purchases. As a result of the announcement of the king's illness, his very successful trade in colored silk, prints, ribbons, and every kind of fancy and colored goods had stopped. Moreover, he went on, "All my hopes are blighted, and I shall be ruined." Another writer to the same paper commented on the total stagnation which that great portion of trade depending upon fashion is now laboring under from the anticipation of a public mourning. 3 weeks later, the king died, and a period of general mourning was declared, which lasted 45 days. When the period of general mourning was brought to a close on 11 August, it was evidently dictated by a considerate regard to the injury which the manufacturers sustained by the event. In general, those who dealt in cloth, ready-made clothes, and accessories were likely to suffer the most unless they were in the specialized world of mourning. With the death of Queen Victoria on 22nd January 1901, the secretary to the Drapers' Chamber of Trade wrote to the Times pointing out that the 12 months of court mourning would profoundly impact on the retail drapery trade since drapers ordered their products 3 or 4 months in advance. For poets, the single greatest source of melancholy poetics may have been a version of Schiller's sense of the conflict between infinite inwardness and finite actuality, the incompatibility of a romantic sense of the infinite, mysterious depths of the self with a Victorian sense of the finite, socially constructed character, perhaps more than any other age. The Victorians experienced the melancholy of time confronting eternity. Further, the legacy of romantic introspection, combined with the loss of dignity and vitality in the world, led to a perceived conflict between the demands of the individual and of society, especially the sense that the social order diminishes the claims of the individual. The dialogue of the mind with itself is, in effect, the dialogue of the ego with the cultural demands of the age, and Arnold represented it in Empedocles on Etna with the figure of a great poetic nature overwhelmed by the little natures that constitute the social order. The brave, impetuous heart yells everywhere to the subtle, contriving head. Great qualities are trodden down, and littleness united is becoming invincible. As Foucault has extensively argued, the social structure of modern Western nations is based empathetically on the internalization of legal and moral policing within the self as conscience. The connection of melancholy with the development of conscience clarifies Hallam's enigmatic comment that for the belated melancholy poet, repentance is unlike innocence. Carlyle, in particular, counseled his generation to close thy Byron, described Shelley, filling the earth with inarticulate wail, like the infinite, inarticulate grief and weeping of forsaken infants, and lamented the diseased self-conscious state of literature as a symptom of age's degradation. At about the same time, John Stuart Mill was urging the young Robert Browning away from diseased self-conscious romanticism by describing his Shelleyan Pauline as morbidity introspective to the point of insanity. By mid-century, Matthew Arnold, returning to the healthier early romantic emphasis on joy that he found in Schiller, was to reject the titanic, Byronic lamentation of his own Empedocles on Etna as morbid and unfitted for poetic representation. The urgency of Arnold's protest against melancholy, however, is symptomatic of the inevitability of melancholy in modern literature. He cited Schiller as his exponent of joy, no doubt because his usual exponents of healthy, strong-minded poetry, Goethe and Wordsworth, could not be drawn on in this context. Wordsworth, as Arnold acknowledged, stanzas in memory of the author of Obermann, attained serenity and joy only because his eyes avert their can form half of human fate, and Goethe, as the author of Faust, was guilty of creating a prototype of just the kind of poetry Arnold was rejecting. For that matter, even Schiller could only be used here if Arnold averted his eyes from the argument on the naive and sentimental in literature that senses and reason are now separated in their function, and the poet no longer gives the impression of an undivided sensuous unit and a harmonious whole. The cultivated poet can only express himself as a moral unit, that is, as someone striving for unity. and is necessarily melancholy because the ideal is an infinite one to which he never attains. Thus, the Victorians' interest in death and mourning manifests itself in literary form in the form of melancholy as well, along with an equally powerful preoccupation with lingering disease, protracted deathbeds, and sudden fatalities, brain fever, and mysterious wasting diseases, madness, and obsession. Such events, scenes, and states of mind proliferate in Victorian novels and poetry. Death and disease are the raw material that Victorian writers shape into narrative and poetic form. Thus, Victorian literature and culture are both marked by a preoccupation with death, disease, and other disturbing subjects. A preoccupation that is undeniably morbid, characterized by excessive gloom or apprehension, or in later use by an unhealthy preoccupation with disease, death, or other disturbing subject given to unwholesome brooding. In the Victorian press, vitriolic accusations of morbidity became one of the most potent weapons in debates about literary and aesthetic value, and such charges were not always leveled at works that dealt with the topics of death or disease. Why did writers, artists, critics, and journalists call anything and everything they found distasteful, morbid, and what did they mean by it? Morbidity in Victorian literature is not just about death, disease, and a horrified fascination with the pleasures and pains of the flesh. Although these are the raw material for many Victorian novels and poems, literary morbidity is a fascination with literary form as well as flesh. The term morbid is originally a medical one, referring to disease or conditions that tend to cause disease, as in books entitled An Inquiry into the Morbid Effects of a Deficiency of Food and On Deafness from Morbid Conditions of the Mucous Membrane of the Stomach, Throat, and Ear. Thus, to call someone or something morbid is to accuse it of being diseased or tending to cause of disease. Another critic, Buchanan's accusation of morbidity draws on already existing discourse of literary morbidity. Before Buchanan leveled the charge of morbidity at Rossetti, other critics had accused Tennyson's Maud, Charlotte Bronte's Villette, and sensation novels of morbidity. The cultural reception of these works eliminates the emergence of morbidity as a formal and thematic concern in Victorian literature. The death culture associated with these notions also refers to how a group of people interacts with death and how their ideas about death express themselves in the day-to-day life. For example, sociologists have referred to modern American society as death denying. We use euphemism for death and generally avoid engaging with it in our day-to-day lives. Other culture may be death accepting or death defying. For example, followers of Hinduism approach death as a tool to access rebirth. This could alternatively be defined by sociologists as death accepting. It readily incorporates the idea of death into the goal of life, or death of defying by framing death not as something to fear but a temporary step to the next stage of life and eventual enlightenment. Victorians do not fit the death denying model. They engaged with death far too readily and lavishly. But to call them death accepting would be a stretch. Death provided a major source of anxiety for them, specifically the fear for a bad death. These representations of death and mourning, both in fiction and in life writing, reveal a sense of distances, dissonance created by the conflicting social and religious expectations surrounding the good death. The rigid protocols for mourning in this period, which fell most heavily on women, often made it difficult for Victorian mourners to express grief in intuitive and authentic ways. These protocols, along with the ideal of the good death, imposed often unattainable expectations on those who were dying as well as their loved one. In fiction, however, it is much easier to be a perfect mourner and achieve a perfect death. Even in novels that do acknowledge. With this, I conclude the lecture, and let us hope that it will be quite helpful to you while knowing about the geology and the very cultural essence regarding morbidity, mourning about Victorian age. I will meet you in the next lecture. Till then, goodbye and thank you.